Hello, welcome to the Sewing Street tutorial channel. My name's Susie Duncan. I'm one of the guest presenters here at Sewing Street, and today I'm going to talk you through some of the basic quilting tools. So we're going to start with your cutting mat. You want to try and get one as big as possible because it will enable you to cut bigger pieces of fabric as time goes on. You want a self-healing mat, and as is this one, a rotating cutting mat is ideal. So let me show you some of the features of the rotating cutting mat. It has this unique locking system on the reverse, which enables you to stabilize it into one position or turn it off, and you can then unlock and rotate the mat in a full 360 circle. You've got your inches marked both horizontally and vertically. You've got all your angles. You've got your 30 degrees, 45 degrees and 60 degrees, which are the angles that you're going to use a lot during quilting if you're doing bias cutting, half square triangles, any of your squaring up of your pieces. It's also a self-healing mat, so that means that as you cut with a rotary cutter, although the rotary cutter will cut into the mat texture itself closes up, so you won't get lots of cuts and slits. So it means the mat will last a lot longer than a normal cutting mat. So it's worth investing in a self-healing cutting mat. They come in various sizes. This is one of the largest rotating mats at 18 inches square, which is a good size if you're using fat quarters. This one is one of the smaller rotating cutting mats at 12 inches square. Remember, you should always put it on a flat surface to use. Again, it's got its inch markings and your angles as well. Great size for your initial piecing, or if you're an English paper piecer, it's a really good size for that. If you don't want to have a rotating mat, then the flat self-healing mats without that locking system are a great alternative. These come in a range of sizes. This one is the A3 size, and it's got centimetres or metric on one side and imperial inches on the other. Again, it's got your 45 and your 60 degree angles marked on it, so you can still do all your squaring up and piecing. It is self-healing as well. You use it on a flat surface, and always store them flat. So under the bed if you need to, or under a table. Don't stand them on their sides, particularly when you get to the really big mats, because they will warp. And the other big no-no for any mat at all is no coffee cups, tea cups, food plates, anything else. It's not a dinner mat, okay? It is a cutting mat. So look after it. So this is a revolutionary idea from the June Taylor company, and it combines both your cutting mat and your ironing board. So if you're a quilter on the go or a crafter on the go, this is a fabulous tool to have. It is 18 inches one way and 12 inches another. So again, you've got a good cutting surface. Now the difference with this mat compared to the self-healing is this surface is designed not to self-heal. It is a much more rigid surface, so you'll hear the noise. It's a bit like cutting on a glass cutting mat when you're doing your cookery, but this one will not heal over as you cut. So with time, this will wear. You've still got your 45 and 60 degree angles, so you can do your squaring up and you can do your bias cutting. But the great thing with this is you flip it over and you've got a perfect ironing surface, which is fantastic for any of your piecing, pressing. You can do your binding, folding on here as well. You've even got the angles marked on here, so if you've got to fold at a particular angle, you've got that. So cutting rulers. Obviously this is personal preference, and my advice would be to go with the one that suits you, which sounds a bit of a weird thing to say, but basically you have to, if you're left-handed, that will make a difference as to which ones you use, because you want one that will work both for a left-handed person. One of my favourites are the creative grids. They are, the reason I like them is because they are ambidextrous, so they work left or right-handed. You've got whole inches marked in white circles, and you've got your half-inch increments marked in black circles. but they will work either way round, and you've got your 45-degree angles, so you can do all your squaring up as well and your bias cuts. This particular size, the 6.5 by 12.5, is the most handy size ruler that I have, and it goes everywhere with me. I love this size ruler. It doesn't get in the way of everything, and you can do a lot with it. The other thing about Creative Grids is they're unique, non-slip splodges, circles, dots, whatever you want to call them, on the back of the ruler, but also around the perimeter at 1/4 inch around two sides and 1/2 inch around the remaining two sides, which means that all of your cutting is going to be completely accurate because your fabric will stay still. An alternative to the standard cutting rulers is the family of Stripology from Creative Grids. These are a slotted ruler, and they're designed to make the whole cutting process not only safer but quicker. And the way they do this is they've got these little teardrops top and bottom of the slits, and then the slit is literally the width of the blade, so only the blade can fit in there. It's got accurate markings in your inches and 1/2 inches, but at one side there is a 1/4 inch mark, so you can do 1/4 and 3/4 inches just by shuffling it across. You've got horizontal inch markings to line up your fabric with, and you've got these fantastic quick cut symbols at 1.5 inches and 2.5 inches, which are common cuts used in quilting. So that's the Stripology family. Between each of the slits you've got your non-slip strip, so again, as you're cutting, it's not going to be travelling across your fabric, and you'll get that downward pressure completely over your piece of fabric. All you have to watch is, as you're cutting, your finger is away from the slot you're cutting in. But they're a really quick and easy tool to work, especially if you're frightened of maths, because it does the maths for you. So if you're going to use a quilting ruler, you will need a rotary cutter. There are lots of different types of rotary cutter, and my advice is to find the one that feels most comfortable to you and that you can use easily. I would start with a 45mm cutter, and what that means is the size of the cutting blade. 45 will allow you to cut through most of your fabrics, even your wadding and batting, as the Americans call it. So you'll get depth. You can cut, if you're bag making, you can get through Styleville. You only really need the 60mm if you're going to start cutting leathers, denims, the more tougher fabric. So with these type of rotary cutter, they've got a soft grip handle, and the blade is released using a slide mechanism, usually located on the top, and as you pull that down, the blade comes away from its housing and you get that release, and you can then use it, and you are in control of it being open or closed just by releasing that button again. Do remember to shut down your blade each time you finish. All the blades are changeable, and I would always encourage changing your blade. I change my blade for every project because then I know I've got a really good sharp blade in there. They do have markings on them. You'd only use those if you were stopping and starting at certain points, which doesn't apply to quilters generally. So that's the 45mm in this sort of button release type, and you also get a similar system, Alpha-Do one, similar type handle. It's not got that silicone cushioning on here, but again it's got a slide release rather than a button, so my blade is released, and it's very easy to change the blades on these as well. So that's an alternative. And then you've got, they come in 28mm size. So if you're doing any rounded cutting, round templates, applique, or perhaps English paper piecing, the 28mm is a perfect size to get round those tight curves or corner round on a bag flap, for example. So that's when I would use my 28mm. Its operation is exactly the same as its big brother. And then finally we have one that I call the hooded or trigger action rotary cutter. Now this one, you can see, is locked. Nothing's going to happen to it. Still got a 45mm blade. To release it, I press that button at the top there, and then as I cut, I have to do that trigger action to release the blade. Now these ones aren't as easy to use with your Stripology family or your June Taylor shape cut. You are better to use the button release ones, because then the blade is fully exposed, because if you let go of that trigger, the blade automatically closes. But if you are a person that has a tendency to walk off and leave their blade, then this is probably a good one for you. If you release and then press that button back, the blade will stay open, so that does save a bit of pressure on your hand. But again, it's got quite a thick housing, so the slotted rulers aren't as easy to use with this. Some of them are angled as well, so you can change the angle of the head, but this one is just static. If you don't like using a rotary cutter, then you're going to be needing a good pair of scissors, and one with a reasonably length blade, otherwise you're going to be cutting forever. So you want a nice soft handle, so an 8.5-inch blade is probably a good idea. And if it's a dressmaking pair of scissors, you find that the bottom of the blade tends to be flat. These are a good set because you get both the larger pair and the small pair as well. And what you want to be careful of is that both of them have good sharp cutting blades right to the tip. So other examples are these ones, but this has a hooded guard as well, but you can see it's got a straight edge, it's sharp all the way to the top. And for these, I mean, even if you use a rotary cutter, a good pair of shears is always handy. But with the small snips, you're going to be using these a lot for cutting thread. You're going to be using them for cutting through seams for small pieces. And if you're an English paper piecer, of course, you're going to be needing a pair of scissors to stick. And then you've got these ones, which are actually ambidextrous, and great if you've got any form of joint issue, because they've got the wider positioning for your fingers out of choice. They're a good option as well. Obviously, one thing you will be needing is fabric. Most quilts are made using a cotton fabric of quilting weight, which means it's a slightly heavier thread count than things like Tana lawn. But Tana lawn is an amazing fabric. It's very lightweight cotton that you use. It's great for blouses because it drapes, but for quilters it tends to be used by the English paper piecers. Don't use it quite so much in big quilts. We go for the heavier duty, more withstanding of washing and wear, the quilting cotton weights. But as you can see, this is just a fraction of what is available, and my advice is go with what you like or what you're making for, rather than just buy everything, because you'll be there forever. But what you do want to make sure is with your quilt is whatever you're piecing, make them the similar weight of fabric. So go for all of one style of quilting cottons, rather than try and mix and match things like toweling into it. If you want to do baby blankets and you want to put fleece on the back, make sure you're using a heavier quilting cotton than using Tana lawn, for example, because you'll find it will slip through your machine and you'll get snags, or you'll get bunching up, which just doesn't look nice at the end result. A good staple is calico. Now that's a much coarser weave. This is unbleached, so you can see it's quite a basic colour, but it's really good for practicing with. It's very good for lining inside of cushions if you're then going to do quilt stitching. So a good stash of that is always useful. And you're going to get your novelty fabrics, your Christmas weights. If you like touchy-feely blankets, especially in the winter and autumn months, you've got your flannels. These have got like a brushed texture to them. They're still a cotton. The print isn't both sides, so it is one-sided, but it gives that soft, luxurious feel, and they will marry quite well with the quilting cotton weights, and you can combine those. but they make fab rag quilts and just cozy lap quilts, or obviously shirts and things like that. But think about what you're matching and how you're handling them. So whatever form of piecing or sewing you're going to do, you're going to need thread. And because you're going to use quilting weight cotton, then it's a good idea to have cotton threads. And these tend to be of a 50 weight, it says on the packaging. You'll find them marked on your spools as well. It just says 50W. That's what you're looking for, WT on some instances. My advice is to use a neutral thread for your piecing. So if you're using predominantly cream or white fabric, then go for a white or grey thread. If you're using black, you want to piece with black because then it's not going to show through. If you're using coloured fabrics, I would tend to use a pale grey because I find they show up least. But it's a great opportunity to use cottons you wouldn't normally, colours you wouldn't normally use, and then save your fancy Nancy colours, your beautiful colours and your variegated threads, and I'll show you what a variegated thread is in a minute, to do your top stitching or hand stitching. So when you're buying your threads, you can buy individual spools and they can come in different sizes. Just buy according to personal preference. I usually buy my neutrals in a bigger spool because I get through those a lot quicker. But buying sets is a great way to buy a lot of colours. You get 6 in this one. 3 of them are plain colour and 3 of them are variegated. And what we mean by variegated is if you look at these threads, they've got more than one colour within them. So the strand itself has like an ombre to it. In this instance it's the aquas through to a teal. This one, it goes from a sort of terracotta orange right through to a pale peach. But they are fab for doing all your quilting and top stitching. I wouldn't use these for piecing because they're too nice for that. But then you've got all these lovely colours as well. Again, these are great for top stitching, adding detail. If you're an EPPer, so that's English paper piecing, then you'll want to look at perhaps a polyester type thread, or one that they call a sew-all thread. And the reason for that is because you're bringing the needle across not just a few strands of fabric, but sometimes hitting the papers that are used for English paper piecing. If you used a cotton, it will have a tendency to snag, to fray a bit more than using a polyester thread. But again, it's personal preference. You can get heavier weight cottons, so if you want to do hand stitching on your quilts or your cushions or your bags, then you can go for a heavier weight cotton, and they are 40-30 type weights. So the smaller the number, the finer the thread. 60 weight is really fine. That's great for English paper piecing, not so good for piecing quilts because it's not as durable as your 50. The 50 weight is ideal for that. But pick your threads according to what you need and have a good stash of neutrals. As you're piecing in quilting, you're going to need to hold your layers together somehow. So it's a great opportunity to invest in some really good clips or pins. Again, that's personal preference, but my advice is have some of each because you'll find a use for both and you'll need both at one stage. Let's start with pins. Now there's a whole plethora of pins on the market. It is well worth investing in the best you can afford. And the reason I should say that is because of all their amazing features. These magic pins, made by Taylor Seville, come in a little caddy, which keeps them secure if nothing else. They've got, these particular ones are their regular 0.6 millimeter. So that's 0.6 millimeter is the width of the actual pin itself. But you can see they've got a really long pin edge to them and really sharp, so they're going to go through your fabric really cleanly. They're not going to snag, and that's what you need with a pin. The other thing I love about these is this silicone grip that's ridged at the end, so it means I can easily grab the pins, I can see them. Even better than that, these are heat resistant, so when I have positioned my pin, particularly if you're trying to seam match, I can still press without worrying about the pin being damaged, burnt, or having that awful mess stuck to the bottom of my iron. So they're your magic pins. They do have different sorts. These are just the regular quilting pins, well worth investment, and these you get 50 in the little case. Great way to store them as well. Quilting clips are something I use a lot. I like their ease of use, the speed of use, particularly as you're sewing. They're quick to remove as you're stitching, so you don't run over them. By the way, never stitch over a pin. It's not good practice, either for your machine, well, particularly for your machine needle, but also for your pins. So always remove the pins as you go. Same with the clips. So clips come in different sorts. You've got these smaller, they're just plastic clips with a metal spring. They usually got one flat side, which means that you can run them on the fabric, the edge of, I use them to hold down the binding as I'm stitching, and it will just hold them flat, and then you remove them as you sew. One thing I do like to do with some of them is to label them, so I just print some alphabetical labels, because when you find your pattern cutting guide, very often they have a piece code to each piece you're cutting, or if you do them numerically, is a great way of keeping all the pieces for each row in aligned as well, so you don't get your rows muddled, because sometimes your layouts, particularly for big king size quilts, can become a bit tricky to work out which one goes there. Especially important if you're doing Bargello. Oh my goodness, you're going to need a lot of clips for that one. Really extra special clips are the magic clips, obviously a family friend of the magic pins, but where these differ from the plastic clips, they've still got the metal spring, but you can see that metal, the legs as it were, come through the whole clip, and your squeeze bit is the plastic, which is much more durable. The hinge bit is also marked at 1/4 and 1/2 inch, so you can actually use these as a seam guide measurement as well. They have one flat edge, so they can sit neatly along your fabric edge, but they will open wide as well, and they'll capture big layers. So when you come to layer your quilt, so you've got your backing, your wadding, and then your quilt top, all of that can be held in these big clips. They're really strong clips. They're not going to fall off as you pick the piece up and take it to your sewing machine. So they're your magic clips. One thing that's useful to have in your stash of basic tools is a fabric marker pen. And this particular one is friction, and it's heat erasable. So I'm going to demonstrate that in a second. And the reason I like the heat erasable is exactly what it says on the tin. It means I can get rid of it once I've used that marking for whatever purpose I'm using it for. You can buy them individually, or you can buy them in sets, and the advantage of the set is you've got your different colours, so depending on the fabric you're marking, you might need a different colour, because for example, if I was using navy blue fabric, blue pen wouldn't show up incredibly well, but a red or a green would show up nicely. If you don't want to use heat erasable, then good old-fashioned tailor's chalk is a great substitute. The advantage of this is that it rubs away instantly. The disadvantage, of course, is that it's soft, but you can sharpen this edge. Just use a piece of sandpaper is what I use to sharpen mine. It comes in a neat case, so it keeps it nice for you, but it is messy as well. You'll need to clean your fingers, otherwise you're going to have chalk marks everywhere. But it doesn't last. Remember, as you touch it, it rubs off. So if you're doing a lot of handling and that mark is important, it may have disappeared by the time you get to piece it. So, but it is choice. For dressmaking, that's probably more useful, but the friction pen, heat erasable pen, is a good way forward for us. So let me just demonstrate the heat erasable mechanism. I'm just going to make sure my iron's coming up to temperature. So with the heat erasable pens, you're going to remove the cap, and then you've got the normal biro type dispenser of the ink, and you can use it to mark if you've got a cutting line, for example, you can just do a solid line. If you're doing your half square triangles, you can do your diagonal lines equally for your flying geese or snowballing, which probably is complete gobbledygook for most of you at the moment, but bear with us and watch the rest of our videos and you'll find out all those things. But once you've got your line and you've done your piecing, if you want to erase that line, all you have to do is put your hot iron over the top, and you can see the markers completely disappeared. And it doesn't come back when it cools down. It's not one of those magic tricks. It's gone for good now. That's it, done. So it makes the perfect tool to mark 1/4 inches or your diagonals. I want to talk a bit about irons, because you'll need an iron. If you don't like ironing your clothes, it doesn't mean you're not going to like ironing your fabric, because what we actually do is press with quilting. You can use your normal iron for sure, but most quilters find having a smaller iron is a really handy tool, particularly when you're pressing seams, because remember, you're only using small scale for piecing. It's only when you get to your big quilt top that your bigger iron is more efficient. There are lots of different ones on the market. This one is the new fabulous decorated Aliso from Tulip Ink. It comes with a silicone stand, so it's heat resistant for your storage, and you can add water if you want to generate steam. I don't use steam for any of my piecing. Some quilters like it, but you've still got your full control on your temperature. But you've got the sole foot plate that's non-stick, but the heat transfer is uniform across this sole. So that's where this particular model comes into its own. And you also get ones that you can carry around. So these are great for if you're going to workshops, if you're quilting on the go. Where these are good is that this case is actually heat insulated, so it means if your iron is still warm, not red hot, warm, you can put it away in here and travel home from your class safely without burning yourself or ruining anything else in the process. Again, they've got a long flex, and you've got that sole plate that's full heat transfer. These are a great little travel iron as well, so double reason to buy them. When you're off on your holes, you can take it with you, and it all folds up neat and tidy to go away in your case. So if you've got an iron, you also need your ironing board. We've got the cut and press here, which is your dual cutting board and ironing table. So this side is all wadded. There's hardboard between the two, so it's a good rigid surface. You always want a really good flat, smooth, no sticky bits on your iron. So you may have to recover. That's not a problem, because I'm sure you've got some stash in your fabric somewhere. So these make a really good ironing surface, much better than a standard ironing board unless you've got a super duper cover. The other thing that I find really useful is a wool pressing mat. They come in different sizes. This one is the 12-inch size, and the reason I like these is they're very dense. Wool is a heat absorber, so it will retain the heat. So when you're piecing and pressing, particularly for foundation paper piecing, or when you're doing quilt as you go, or half square triangles, because you've got heat retention within the base itself, it means that the fibres in your fabric are already relaxing as they're sitting on the surface, and then when you apply the heat from the iron at the top, you're getting that sort of double sandwich of heat. So a wool pressing mat is a good investment, and you can still spray and use steam on these. You'll just get that sort of damp sheep smell, because that's what it is. It's a wool from a sheep, but they are a really good buy. And the other thing I like about all of these, because they are very well wadded, is that when you're piecing, to get accurate seam placement, they are great for putting your pins through the seams into pieces to get those seams aligned. Because they're dense, they hold the pins upright and you'll get accurate piecing. So make sure you've got a good ironing surface. Before you start any of your quilting projects or bag making, in fact any project, the first thing you're going to need to do is to press your fabric, because when it comes to you it's going to have been origami folded neatly into a parcel, and you want to get all those creases out because otherwise your cutting is not going to be accurate. An extra addition to that pressing process would be a fabric stabilizer. I use these with all my fabrics before I start cutting them, because then I know the cut is really straight and the fibres are fully relaxed and stabilised before I start the cut process. You've got there's lots of different varieties on the market. My go-tos are June Taylor's Starch Savvy, Best Press, which comes in a variety of different smells, aromas. I usually say flavours, you're not going to be drinking it. And then you've got Flatter, again, different smells and mixtures within them. They're all plant-based. They aren't dangerous for your fabric, they're not dangerous for you, they don't mark your fabric even though they smell. The smell penetrates into your pressing mats and your ironing boards as well, so you get the most glorious smell as you continue to press. But they are an essential, I think, to your quilting process. It just keeps everything crisper, particularly if you're cutting on the bias. So if you're doing bias binding, or if you're doing half square triangles or half rectangle triangles, then I would always say use your fabric stabilizer. Super easy to use. They all come with a spray top. It doesn't take ages to do it. So one piece of equipment that nobody likes but is absolutely essential is an unpicker. Now these are consumables. You're not going to have the same unpicker unless you've never unpicked a seam that you started your sewing journey with. You do need to replace them. Let me explain the geography of an unpicker. So they're like a U-bend, and right in this bottom turn is a blade. So that's the bit that's sharp, and that's the bit that unpicks your threads. And that's why I say you're going to need to replace these, because that will wear with time, depending on how much unpicking you have to do. Now there's different ways of using your unpicker and in different formats. You can use this point at the top here to lift the thread that you've sewn. You just work along that stitch line, undoing the thread. So it will snap as it hits the blade, but that's okay. You can just work along, and tedious as it is, it's effective. It's undoing that seam. And then the other side we can use to just lift out that thread that's come loose. So that seam is now open. To use the blade bit at the bottom, so that's if you're doing a long seam, that's a quick way of doing a seam. I work from the top, and you want that ball bit to be underneath, and then you can slide along a seam quite quickly, and it literally just cuts the threads. Now the advantage of this is that it's quick. The disadvantage is that you get left with lots of threads that you then have to go along and pull away, otherwise it's going to look like Thread City when you're finished. But just be careful with that method that you are actually cutting the thread, not the fabric. So that's why I tend to hold it up so that I'm pulling that seam slightly, not a lot of tension because you don't want to rip it, but ball end in, and you can work your way along a flat seam reasonably quickly. So hopefully you won't have to do that too often. But that is an unpicker that you'll need as a consumable. All quilts have a inner layer. If you imagine a sandwich, we talk about quilt sandwiches, the middle bit or your filling is some form of wadding or batting. They're both the same. So if you see either in a pattern, then that is what they're talking about. There are lots of different types of batting on the market, or wadding. It's what the purpose of the quilt is that you choose. and personal preference after that. So if you're doing children's play quilts, or you're doing quilts that are going to get a lot of use and rough and tumble, going to be going through the washing machine regularly, then polyester is quite a popular type. These are very good for baby quilts as well, because they give that warmth without being too hot. Natural fibres tend to get too hot for babies. They prefer to have the polyester ones. So then you come on to cotton waddings, and these have been felted down, so that means they've been literally pricked with needles until they're compressed, and they're very soft and luxurious to the touch. This one is an 80-20, so it's 80% cotton and 20% polyester, and that's probably my go-to for everything. You can piece them as well, so a piece this size is great for a lap quilt, but if I needed it bigger and I had extra small pieces, I can always use a wide zigzag to join them together, and they're perfectly fine and acceptable for that. They are durable for washing, and they don't fluff, they don't pill, they lay flat. And take a note of what's on the label, because what they give you is a guide as to how far apart you should quilt stitch in order for the whole quilting process to be effective. And by that I mean, the reason why we layer and then do lots of fancy stitching or straight line stitching or whatever you do, is because it's not only holding those layers together, but it's providing that sort of quilt pucker that we see with handmade quilts. And that's what we're after. So that's 80-20. You can get 50-50, you can get 100% cotton. I tend to use this sort of off-white one more than I use black. I would use black if I was doing a very dark coloured quilt, because then you'll get none of the fluff or pill coming through your quilt stitchings and being seen. Here's a mini version. So imagine this is my pieced top. When I come to quilt, create a quilt sandwich, I would always cut my backing fabric and my wadding bigger than my pieced front, and then I can go ahead and quilt it and finish it off, square it off, and then bind it. But that's a quilt sandwich. So backing, wadding, top. When you come to piece your quilt together and create a quilt sandwich ready to do all your quilt stitching before you bind, you're going to first of all, you need to make sure that everything is pressed flat. I always press my backing fabric. Shouldn't need to press your wadding, because that usually is wrinkle free, and I always press my quilt top. Don't worry about squaring off the edges. You're going to do all that once you've done your quilt stitching. But one thing you will need, or I like to use at least, are the removable temporary adhesives, either the Odif 505 spray or June Taylor quilt basting spray. These are super easy to use, and the advantage of these over the pins and clips that are available is that you're not going to risk pricking your finger with a pin as you sew, because there's none there. It's all going to be held for you. They're like any spray, so you're going to take the lid off, give it a good shake. Please work in a well ventilated area, not in a closed room with the windows shut if you're going to be basting a big quilt, because you will find the fumes will be quite powerful. Now imagine this is a big quilt, so I would be rolling back half of my quilt. I'd then give this a good shake, and from about 30 centimetres I would spray evenly, just very lightly, across the wadding. So always spray your wadding. I would then, working from the centre, open it out, smooth down, and that would adhere that side. I'd then come round the piece or turn it round, roll back to where it will go to, so that will be, it will stop rolling there because it's stuck. Repeat that process and then roll it all out, and you're going to do that for the backing and the top. The other alternative, of course, is to use pins, or the quilt clips that look like overgrown safety pins, but as I said, the disadvantage of those is you've then got pins around your sewing machine that you risk, because you're going to be rolling this to get it under your sewing machine. You're going to have pins sticking out everywhere, so the adhesive spray works really well. The other thing with the spray is it will hold those layers together for a period of time. So I have quilt tops that I've spray basted and are still sat there 6 weeks later, and they're still stuck, they're not going anywhere. It doesn't damage your sewing machine needle or your feed dogs on your sewing machine, so it's safe to use and easy to use. Of course, to do all your quilting, a sewing machine is essential unless you want to hand sew the whole thing. The sewing machine you choose, obviously you're going to have a budget, so work to your budget, but think not today, think 3, 4, 5, 10 years time, because you want to grow through that process and your sewing journey. The critical thing for quilting is a 1/4 inch seam. So the more settings available on the machine that gives you a true 1/4 inch, the better. But again, you need to be comfortable with your machine. If you're going to a lot of workshops, you want a machine that's portable. If you're a stay-at-home quilter, then you can go for a much bigger machine. If you're going to do a lot of quilt stitching on the machine, of big quilts like your king size quilts, think about the throat space here. This one has a particularly large throat space, so I can easily get a quilt, a king size or queen size quilt rolled up into the throat space. The other thing you want to think about is stitches. If you like decorative stitches when you're doing your piecing, think about what decorative stitches are available. Always have a look at all of those. You might want buttonholes, you might want clasp stitches, which are a great way of holding your quilt sandwich together. Think about those as well. The bobbin winding system, your thread load, are pretty standard on most machines, so they're a given. Lighting, think about the lighting. This one has LED lights coming underneath, but it also has a slide out extra LED light, so I can easily see my sewing surface. The other thing that I like is having interchangeable foot plates so that I can stop the edge of pieces, particularly when I'm sewing from a point going down and getting chewed up into the feed dogs. So you want your straight stitch plate, or in this case this has a professional grade. You might want what we call the free arm, so that means all of this comes away and leaves you a much narrower sewing bed, but that enables you to get round cuffs of sleeves, small pieces, tops of bags. If you're making your storage caddies, for example, you'll need that to be able to sew round the top easily without disruption. The extension table, absolute must when you start quilting, because you want that support. This one has adjustable legs and it has a really large extension table that can fit, so I can fit it to any surface, but it gives me a much bigger area of support for anything I'm sewing. So when you start doing 12-inch blocks and bigger, and your whole quilt top, putting your rows together, this gives the support you need. So just think about your sewing machine, what you want it to do, what you're going to be doing with it today as well as in 10 years time. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe to the Sewing Street tutorial channel, then you'll be able to watch all our new and previous tutorials for all your quilting and sewing projects.